Okay, I want to hear about this on the other side of the break with Richard C. Hoagland. We're going to skip the break after that for behind the scenes at PresentPlanet.tv. We'll be back in just a few minutes with Richard C. Hoagland. Then we're going to get into the beginning of NASA. The three groups that made up the founding of NASA, which is a creature of the president, a creature of the executive branch. Dark Majesty. It's Tex Mars' book, Getting into the Whole Secret Government, available at Infowars.com. And a book that gets even more in-depth into NASA and how this whole empire hooks together is Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA. Richard C. Hoagland, who was a consultant at NASA, curator of a major museum, designed some of the things that were sent out on deep space aircraft, came up with the conceptual ideas for it, and, of course, worked with Walter Cronkite there at CBS News, is our guest. We've gotten to the point where you're sitting in there the first time your correspondent is going to be allowed, or correspondent period, to talk to the astronauts when they're on the moon. Go ahead. Yeah,
I think you meant deep space spacecraft, not aircraft, right?
Yes. No, deep space aircraft, deep space hot air balloons.
Anyway, so we're sitting around in the executive producer's suite, because he had a big office and a suite, and we're just kicking back. It's on a Sunday afternoon, and we're watching our guy. Remember, NASA used to jealously guard any access to the astronauts. During the Mercury program, they had what they call the capsule communicator, the Capcom, who was usually another astronaut. And even the flight directors or the head of NASA normally would go through the Capcom to talk to the crews in orbit, as opposed to picking up the phone or picking up the mic and talking to them direct. So this was a real break with this tradition. It was the first time that ordinary reporters were going to be allowed to ask questions directly of a NASA crew in space during a live mission. So it was a big deal for the network, and it was a big deal for our unit and all that. So we're sitting there watching to see how it was going to play out. And NASA comes on and says, I think it was Paul Haney in those days, well, we're having a small delay. The press conference will be in 15 minutes or something like that. So we had another round, right? And then he comes on again. Well, the press conference is we're having a small technical problem. The spacecraft has not yet risen over the horizon at Goldstone. Goldstone was one of the big tracking stations. So we have to wait for acquisition of signal. Something about that kind of bothered me. So I literally took I was sitting in a chair by Wessler's desk, so I took the back of an envelope on his desk, and I started to do some scribbling, some calculations. And I looked at my numbers, and I thought, this is nuts. And I shoved the paper over to Wessler, and I said, Bob, NASA's lying. If that's true, if what they're saying is true, those damn mountains have to be 5 miles high. And they're not. And that was the first time two things hit. One was that this agency that I believed was the agency was for some stupid reason not telling us the truth, couldn't figure out what the agenda was. And then the reaction from my own, guy who had hired me was, oh, come on, you got to be wrong. NASA would not lie. And this had persisted down to the present. The mainstream media, even when this agency has killed people, I'm talking Challenger, I'm talking Columbia, I'm talking bizarreness like the Lisa Nowak case, which makes no sense at all unless you start asking deeper questions. NASA is a we can do no wrong agency even when they're blatantly, flagrantly doing wrong. And that, to me, has been a mystery that still fascinates me, because it's like with so much demonstrable, not only just error, but deliberate malfeasance, deliberate, skullduggery, deliberate lying. Why does this agency maintain this pristine example of the, as Reagan used to say, the shining city on the hill? And that's another question that I don't have a good answer for, but I want a lot of people to think about it, because unless we crack the facade, I mean, there are other institutions in this society where no matter what you lay out, people will not believe that your data is right, and the institutional facade or persona or manufactured image is wrong.
Well, here's an example. That happened first. I mean, a good example is at first they would bust high-level Catholic priests, cardinals, fathers, monsignors, raping children, and for decades the police wouldn't even investigate or prosecute because you don't go after a cardinal, you don't go after a bishop, you don't go after a bigwig. I mean, that's impossible. It can't be true, and now we know about a third of them, it turned out, were involved in the cover-up. I mean, is that a good analogy?
It's an excellent analogy, and in fact, I was kind of in the back of my mind, that being a Reformed Catholic, that was kind of what was on my mind.
Wow. Okay, well, stay there. We're going to talk behind the scenes about some of the things you want to bring up. When we get back, the basic history of NASA, all verifiable, but still just amazing. Then we'll get into mind control. Are they covering up artifacts on the moon and Mars? A lot more.
We're on the march. The Empire's on the run. Alex Jones and the GCN Radio Network.
Hello, I'm Dr. Leonard Horowitz.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and talk to him behind the scenes. Mr. Hoagland.
Yes, sir.
I think the interview's going great. For folks that are watching out there, I want to keep the discussion congruent, so we'll come back to the history of NASA when we return. But in the 2.5 minutes, we've got to tell stories. So you start questioning NASA at that point. You start saying, we're being lied to. There's no way the radio signals couldn't get over mountains unless they were 5 miles tall.
Well, remember, you're on a rotating planet, so things rise and set. So they were waiting for the spacecraft literally rise over the horizon of Goldstone, which is located west of Los Angeles, out in the desert there at a place called Barstow, California. And my calculation proved unequivocally that the spacecraft had already risen. Because we had charts and maps. I mean, NASA used to give us incredible information.
No, I understand. So then you start questioning, what was the next lie you caught him in?
Oh, God.
I mean, now you're looking for lies. What was the next big one you remember?
This was one of those, it's kind of like if you have an impenetrable shield and something cracks the shield, from then on you start asking, why are they saying this? It only takes one event. Swan swallows and make a summer, as the cliche goes. And it was at that point that I realized that NASA would lie. And it turned out later that the reason for the lie, this is what's the kicker, was so incredibly stupid and trivial. It turned out that Jules Bergman, who was one of the correspondents, or the lead correspondent, we had Cronkite, we had Huntley and Brinkley over at CBS, and then we had, what's his name, Jules Bergman at ABC, because we only had 3 networks in those days. Bergman wanted to be an astronaut. He did all the stuff. He went through the chill tanks and the whirligigs and all the training that the astronauts had gone through to prove that, it was basically the right stuff. His testosterone level was pretty high. Actually, I knew him. He was a pretty great guy. He actually asked me for some information when I was pool correspondent.
Sure, but what was the reason?
Well, the reason was Jules Bergman. He had drunk too much the night before, and he was hungover in his motel room, and he got to the Space Center late. And all of NASA was holding this press conference to cover for Bergman being basically hungover.
And that's how a lying culture starts, though, is you lie for little reasons. Instead of saying we're late with the press conference, they tell a lie, and then you start investigating and find bigger ones.
Well, the thing was here they were lying to protect one of their own, which was a double communication. Sure,
here we go. We're going back live on the main show right now with Richard C.Hoagland. Here we go, Richard.
Every morning at the mine, you could see him arrive. He stood 6'6" and weighed 245, kind of broad at the shoulder, narrow at the hip. And everybody.
The book is a New York Times bestseller, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA. For folks watching at PrisonPlanet.tv, you can see the cover of the book with the Grand Masonic flag on it there. We're going to talk about that later. You can get the book at bookstores everywhere, or Mr. Hoagland, what's the best site to visit to get your book or to learn more about the huge overarching things that you're doing?
Darkmission.net. We've set up a website for the book.
But then you also have the Enterprise group.
I have the Enterprise mission, yes, but that's basically a huge panoply of everything. If you're focused on the book and how to get it and the discussions going on, Mike Barra, my co-author, has a blog over there, and we publish new events around the book. Darkmission.net is the place to go.
Darkmission.net. But go ahead and plug your other sites while we're at it.
EnterpriseMission.com. Everything you ever wanted to know about the space program that you were afraid to ask or didn't know who to ask is at EnterpriseMission.com.
Well, let's start getting into the history of NASA. You've got connections to L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, Nazis, occultists. I mean, this, and then we see all the occultism and their symbols, their names. Break that down for us, Richard.